Good evening, everyone. Got several people here already. Oh, actually, a pretty good crowd already tonight. And yeah, got several here on Facebook, several on YouTube. And as we go, any comments you make, I will see those from either place and would love the chance to interact with you. And looks like Merced is here as well. Hey, Merced, good to see you. All right, so this is going to be the next to last lesson in the study we've been doing. Let me get on over to my home slide here. There we go. So this is going to be the next to the last lesson in the story of God's people. So we've done this kind of sweeping overview of the biblical story. And so we'll be close to wrapping it up today. The plan is to wrap it up next week. Based on the feedback and some suggestions I was getting, seems like down the line there will be some pretty strong interest if we were to do like a Holy Spirit study. And I'm open to that, but want a little time to prep for that. And then along with that, okay, got several people chiming in now. Hello, Lucille. Hello, Kathy. Easter Bell is here and Carolyn is here. So good to see all of y'all with us. But yeah, several people expressed interest in perhaps like a Holy Spirit study, which I think would be worthwhile for us. And then another thing that was suggested that I think is a good suggestion is that maybe we could do a study of prayer. I don't know if I guess I posted this on my Facebook wall, but I'm actually getting ready this month. In fact, I'm going to be teaching a course for the Harding School of Theology as an adjunct professor, and I'm teaching a course in spiritual formation. And so right now I've been kind of behind the scenes ramping up a lot on stuff like, prayer and other spiritual practices. And so I'm kind of in a good zone right now to do a prayer class, I think. And so I would like to go that route. And again, am thinking of Holy Spirit study down the road. But again, yes, thank you, Easter. I think there would be a lot of interest in doing it. I just it's a tough topic, and it's not one in Churches of Christ we have always really spent a lot of time on, frankly. And so that one for me, I always approach a little tentatively. I want some opportunity to really refresh myself and kind of make sure I get my head around it a little bit before I try to start explaining it to anyone. So Joy is here. Good to see you, Joy. And looks like Alma and Cheryl Lynn is here. Yeah, good. All right. Well, glad to have everyone. Yeah, we got a good crowd already tonight. Well, let me launch ahead. So we've kind of looked at the overall movements of the biblical story. Begins with God and the nature of God, God as Trinity, God as this loving presence, and then out of His love and out of His delight, He creates the world. Obviously, the world takes a turn for the worse as people start making selfish decisions. There's the flood story. There's the scattering of people with the intent of trying to fill the earth with righteousness. Eventually, what it comes down to is that God selects an individual family through whom eventually Jesus is going to come. So fortunately, Abraham does happen to be a person of remarkable faith. We've been studying Abraham on Sunday mornings in our sermons. But God starts with Abraham, and much of the biblical story is a working out of God preserving this family line despite great obstacles so that one day Jesus would come from them. It is often not the case that they showed any moral superiority to the peoples around them, quite the opposite. But just the same, because of Abraham's faith, God decided to bless him richly. God had made a promise to him. And so that results in Abraham's family expanding and growing. They spend some time in Egyptian captivity. They're set free. They go from being like a large family group, kind of a collection of tribes, to starting to become more of a people who occupy a territory as they eventually move into the promised land. From there, they get more formal structure. There's a king involved. It's an actual kingdom. They've got their own government. There's division between north and south. Eventually, the north is conquered. The south remains a little while longer, and then they're conquered. And then everything goes into exile, anticipating the coming of the Messiah. We've talked about the life of Christ, His teachings. We've talked about His death and resurrection. And the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at God sending the Holy Spirit, kind of initiating the church to really get going on the mission. And so we've been there for a couple of weeks. Last week we looked at the first two missionary journeys of Paul, and we talked some about how at the start of the missionary journeys, it wasn't necessarily the case that someone had this great idea about starting to do things with missionary journeys. It was more like initially, because of persecution, the church had to scatter, but as they scattered, they brought their Christian faith with them. And so eventually that started leading to some other kinds of things. And so initially it was a problem that they had to deal with, kind of a dilemma that became kind of a new paradigm as Paul and Barnabas and later Paul and Silas started traveling to both go and visit and encourage churches that they knew, and then also to help plant new churches in other areas. And so that's an exciting time. Something that's been weighing on me the last few days is, there's so much pressure with all the COVID stuff, which is ongoing. Like, obviously we care about people's safety, and that remains a high priority for us. But then also thinking about, not just a virus, but actual people trying to find you and hunt you down and kill you. Church has often not been a very safe thing to be part of. There are many times throughout history where it's been profoundly dangerous to be a Christian, as we'll see in Paul's missionary journeys. Some of the time, there's no other way to put it, but that things just went really badly. Like, they'd get beaten up and arrested, and attempts were made on their lives. Thank God for brave Christians who endured great dangers for the sake of the faith. It's been something I've been thinking about some lately. All right, let me keep moving ahead. We're just about done with this book. I do have a few copies if you should want one. Passing the Torch is the title for this week's lesson. And actually, this is going to tie in nicely to what I do Sunday. This coming Sunday will be the last of the lessons in the Abraham series. And we'll be looking at Sarah. She passes, but then also Abraham doesn't pass immediately. He lives quite a while longer, but he's also thinking about how to set up Isaac for success and passing things on for him. It's a conversation. It's a topic that we all need to think about. How do I make sure that other people are able and ready to come along and to serve? How do we pass the torch? So here's a couple of starter questions. I am hoping you will have some great comments on this. You have probably seen a person transition at some point in your life, and that I would love it if it's a church setting. That'd be easy to apply, but really we could talk about a lot of different settings. When you've seen someone who's transitioned power from themselves to their successor, what are the best versions of that you've seen? Who has done that really well? What has made that work well? And the second question kind of ties into it. What is a hindrance to good transitions? So if something needs to happen, there does need to be a transfer of leadership. And let's say that it has gone badly. What are some of the things that would hinder a transition from going well? I'm confident y'all must have some thoughts on this. I'm interested in what you have to say, but thinking of those two angles, when it's done really well, what does it look like? Or conversely, if it's done really poorly, what might that look like? What helps it to go well? What stops it from going well? Interested. I definitely have a few of my own thoughts, but I'm going to reserve them until I start hearing some of your thoughts, and then I'll engage with you a little bit. But feel free to take a couple of minutes, type out your comments, send them, and I'm glad to see what you have to say. But good transitions, poor transitions, what have you seen? What does it look like? It is the case that all of us reach the point where we can't do what we once did. We all get to that point somewhere in life where, whether or not it's us realizing it about ourselves or other people realizing about us, hey, it is actually time for me to move out of this role, to let someone else step into these shoes. Sometimes there comes a time for that. Thank you, Cheryl. And she's saying, and I wasn't here for this one, obviously, the transition from Buck to Mark Pugh, she says, was handled well. Cheryl, if you have thoughts about what helped make that go well, thinking of transitions from my angle, my personal experience, I would be very affirming of Buck. Speaking, as candid as you can be in a thing that you're broadcasting to the world. I was, at the prospect of coming down, even though Buck had been out of the pulpit for some time, whenever you're following someone, and Buck wouldn't say this about himself, I'll say it about him. He is a living legend, right? Like, especially in the prison ministry circles. Buck is very broadly, deeply respected. The prospect of following someone like that can be pretty challenging, can be pretty intimidating. And again, even though I was following the guy who followed Buck, if Buck had a disposition to make things difficult, he really yields a lot of influence and could do that. But thank God, Buck has never been that kind of person. Since I got here, I know Buck has done nothing but encourage me and compliment me. There have been occasions where he's offered me a helpful perspective that maybe I wasn't seeing, but he's always gentle and respectful. I have never at any point in time felt like Buck was doing anything other than rooting for my success here. And so even though I'm, one removed from Buck, I can say that his attitude and disposition, that dynamic of having the former guy around could be very challenging. Buck has never made that the case for me. I'm really grateful for the way he conducts himself and the blessing he continues to be to our church, having been here for a very, very long time. But it is the case that we all reach that point that we need to make a transition. I've thought about that a lot now with ministry. One of the hard things is that most churches feel like the magic bullet for their success is that you want to hire a guy who's kind of, young family guy, 2.5 kids, mid-30s, but 20 years of experience sort of thing. They have a lot of unrealistic expectations. But I've had quite a few friends in ministry who get to be like mid-50s and absolutely no one will even give them a look. And, I've been on the younger end of that stick for a while. And I'm not naive enough to know that at some point I won't be looking down the other end of it myself. And I've wondered about that before. How do people perceive you? Even though I would say mid-50s isn't old, but there's a lot of pressure these days to be the young megachurch type pastor with spiky hair and bleached blonde teeth, or bleached teeth and a bleached blonde wife, all that stuff. So I do think sometimes what does transitioning look like? How do you know when it's your time to make a move? This is good. Thank you, Cheryl. We involved the entire church in the conversation and choice. I like that. Thank you, Cheryl. So there's a lot of ownership. There's a lot of involvement. Search committee did due diligence. It was clear to y'all that the people working on this were being, transparent with the process. Buck was wanting it to happen. He was supportive of it. Nearly everyone was positive about the change. So that sounds like a win-win to me, Cheryl. And thank you for typing that out and sharing that with us. I'm sure there are others of you who have witnessed transitions before. I'm curious, what helps good transitions to happen? What works against good transitions? But here's a dilemma we've all got to face. This is Paul thinking about what needs to happen in light of that dilemma, that one of these days I'm going to have to pass the torch on to someone else. He says in 2 Timothy 2, which is one of the very last letters he ever wrote, "And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." So yeah, there has got to be, I like that in this statement, it's not just like one generation away, right? He's thinking already 2 generations away. We need to make sure we entrust this to faithful people who are going to tell it to others. And by implication here, they're also going to be taught and prepared for the work of ministry and service and all the different things we do as Christians. But important that we're thinking in these terms, that we need to be seeking out reliable people and we need to be entrusting things to them. What does it look like to entrust something to someone? It means they actually get to have ownership of it, right? To Cheryl's point from a moment ago, that people get to be part of what's happening, and that as leaders, it can be easy to hang on to too much control or to become this bottleneck that nothing can get done unless it goes through me or through us. And boy, that's sure counterproductive ultimately in the kingdom. Being willing to see another person successful in a role, not insisting that, on the one hand, it's like I want to do really good work. I've known ministers who've really struggled with, I had this good run and I did some good things, but now that it's time for the next person to come along, I kind of don't want them to succeed because I want to be the best there ever was, right? We've got to get over ourselves. We've got to move past ourselves. So he's saying, surely there's got to be reliable people who are qualified also to teach others and to carry on the mission. So we got to think in those terms. Sandy makes a good point here. A transition could certainly be made difficult if the person transitioning out is leaving involuntarily. That is absolutely true, Sandy. I'm in a secret Church of Christ ministers group. There's about 800 of us in there on Facebook. I guess it's not a secret if I talk about it, so I just won't say the name of it. But there's a group of us, and at times I actually have to just disengage from that group for a while because it is just so emotionally heavy to see how many ministers end up leaving on very poor terms with churches. And some of the stories just really make you shake your heads in terms of, like, I don't want to call it blackmail, but it's kind of like, if you'll tell the congregation that you're leaving on your own because you want to, we'll give you this much severance. And if you won't tell them, and if you tell them that we fired you, we give you nothing. It's that kind of stuff where you would think that churches are above behaviors like that, but unfortunately not the case in many places. Glad not to have been part of anything like that myself, but yeah, when the person transitioning is doing it involuntarily, it makes it harder on everyone. And so again, that's part of why I do always think about, and I haven't reached a conclusion yet. How do I know when I get to the point that it's time for me not to try and do the things that I'm doing? I don't feel like I'm even close to being there yet, but all of us, I think, do everyone else a favor when we're at least introspective and we have some people in our lives that will be honest enough with us, that we trust enough that they could say, hey, you might want to think about this or that, and we would be ready to receive a word like that. Okay, so what I wanted to look at as we continue the story, we looked last time at the first two missionary journeys. This time we're looking at the third missionary journey. Trajectory of it looks very similar to the second missionary journey in several ways. But Paul sends Timothy on ahead to Macedonia. And the intention is, to go and visit Macedonia, which he will. But he's doing a lot of really good preaching in Ephesus. There's some things that are going phenomenally there. But just as much as there's some strong positives, there are some really strong negatives. It ends up causing a riot. It's kind of a selfish, materialistic driven thing where people are worried about their pocketbooks, but there's rioting in Ephesus. And this is followed by, once Paul gets to Macedonia, there are plots against his life. So this becomes a major ordeal to try and kind of smuggle Paul around because he is a wanted person by many groups who would love to see him dead, taking oaths that they will end his life. Once he returns to Jerusalem, Paul ultimately is arrested, and because he's a Roman citizen, he is able to make an appeal to Caesar himself. And so even though there's kind of a lower level official who I think kind of wished he could have sorted things out with Paul's situation, because Paul appealed to Caesar, that was where he was going to head. And so the way that Acts ends is with Paul finally in Rome, and he's under house arrest. He's able to interact with people. One of the frustrating things about the book of Acts is that, you kind of wish you had a nice, ribbon at the end of it to tie off the story. We got this great bookend on the front end where we transition from Luke's gospel. Jesus has said, stay in the city until I send you, the Spirit from on high. And the Spirit arrives. It's like this great starting point. You get to the end of Acts and it's like, clearly this wasn't the end of Paul's life. It wasn't the end of the work of the church. You wish you could have some kind of ending that said, and they all lived happily ever after or something. But the truth is, it's a continuing story. And there's many ways that I think the ending of Acts is appropriate for the subject matter, because the story of Acts, ultimately, isn't it a story that we're still part of? That we are still part of the unfolding of the mission of the church. Over the centuries, we have seen the church rise and decline in places. Fascinatingly, in the earlier centuries, it was places like Syria and Ethiopia and other places in North Africa and the Middle East where Christianity was booming. But then, as Christianity started to spread into Western Europe, eventually to make it over into the United States and these other places, some of the spots where Christianity had originally been the strongest, it had diminished considerably in its influence as Islam began to grow. And so now we're in the situation where many of the Western nations who had been so strong have been in a period of decline, as we are. And then you see what's called the global South, Asia, Africa, South America. There is a huge, huge revival going on in these places, and the church is growing and expanding rapidly. So if you were to come down to earth and do a news report on a lot of the most exciting things happening in the church, a whole lot of your stories would be coming from places other than where we live. There's just big things happening around the world. But I do think it's the case that we're all still, in many ways, a significant part of this story and its unfolding. If we were to work at it, isn't it the case that we could gradually work our way backwards, and somewhere we would find the link between something that Paul did and where we are today? Somewhere along the way, there was a church who raised up people and trained up people and commissioned them, who led new efforts, who spread the gospel to new places, and so on and so on. Somewhere down the line, you can connect every church to the earliest church. And I think that's an exciting thing to think about, that all of us are here because there have been faithful links in the chain ever since these stories in the book of Acts. And if we do our part, we become a strong link and an ongoing chain that, for as long as the Lord wills it to go on, there's exciting things that can still happen. God is very patient with the world. So while Paul is under arrest in Rome, Paul doesn't just sit still, does he? When Paul is in jail, there's people he's reaching out to. The Philippian jailer, he ends up converting his whole household. When Paul is under arrest, he sits down and writes letters to the Ephesians, the Philippians, the Colossians, and also to Philemon. And it seems that Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon were probably sent together in a bundle. And it's helpful, I think, to read those three books in light of each other, especially. Not that you don't do that with all the New Testament, but when you know these are coming out of a similar context to similar groups of people, that can be helpful. But the book of Ephesians is interesting because you can tell with Philippi, for example, this is a congregation that Paul knows very, very well personally. They've been a major sponsor of his mission work over the years. He writes in a different tone to the people that he knows better, as opposed to the Ephesians, where it seems that when you would speak of Ephesus, it's not like just a city. There's kind of a whole region that he could be talking to, and it's a little broader in the language that gets used. So just the way that you would address a large region differently than you would address a single congregation, Paul's kind of doing that here. But that's exactly it, Kathy. While he's there, it's like, okay, if I'm going to be arrested, here's the new way that I'm going to start communicating. And someone pointed out to me, we should all take some encouragement from this, because in the pandemic, where all of a sudden, like, the ways we could meet were pretty much limited to what we could do online, someone reminded me that all of the earliest church correspondences, they had all kinds of significant correspondences that weren't in person. And so we're doing it on a screen. Paul did it in letters, but just the same, it was kind of virtual communication of sorts. And so the church has a very long history of surviving times of being distanced from each other. It's all right. But something really interesting I meant to grab, and I do not have in front of me. Kevin has got this great book in his office about letter writing in the ancient world, and someone calculated the cost involved of composing several of Paul's letters, and I just couldn't believe it. It was like, even Philemon would have been several $100s, but the cost of producing most of these letters would have been similar to that of buying like a decent used car. Very expensive. The materials were expensive. The skill and talent involved could be formidable. And the transmission process, like it was actually a pretty big deal to send a letter. And surely this is part of why Paul puts so much work into the things that he says, because it's like for us to go to the trouble of creating one of these things, it's going to be treated as something valuable. It's going to be transmitted carefully. And I don't know. I just thought that was super interesting. I'd never really considered that, because for us, letter writing is, we're almost annoyed by it these days, right? When you get all the junk mail, it's such a refreshing thing when you get something that actually is handwritten. But if I wanted to write you a letter, I could sit down and do it on a piece of scratch paper, and for a little under 50 cents, you could have it in the next couple of days. This is nothing like letter writing in the ancient world. I feel the family has grown closer in our social distancing. Kathy, I think we have certainly come to value the time we have together more. And once you've been denied the opportunities for fellowship, it makes you see them differently than when you could just take them for granted. Because, I can go anytime I want. Well, what if you can't go anytime you want? I would like to think that we've gotten closer. Truthfully, it has been a struggle. I know that I have struggled a lot with, how do you care for people pastorally? How do you connect with people enough? And all the times that you can't do anything in person, and we've had to do it just through phone calls or other things. It's been a really hard time. I think we've all tried, but a struggle for me has been, I don't feel like none of us feel really completely satisfied with the world as it is, right? We're all kind of yearning for something better, and it's hard not to project that on each other. Sometimes I think we are maybe not as understanding with each other, because it's like, I know you're really miserable, but I'm also miserable. Like we're all in this together. Once Paul is in Rome, there is good reason. It's not in Scripture. There's very good reason to believe that both Paul and Peter were martyred there in Rome, and so that's ultimately where their participation in this world and the church's story ends. But things continue. Here you go. This is good. Imagine Paul's resume. Well, I've been arrested and jailed 3 to 4 times. I was whipped twice, stoned once. Oh, and I started up churches in 20 cities and sent out 12 to 13 letters. I've mentored many people. My hope is that they'll be leaders in the next generation. And, something that's significant too, Cheryl and Randall, when we talk about starting up churches, if you do the research on what Paul brought with him, Paul didn't just go by himself and plant churches by himself. When Paul went to plant churches, we think his team could have involved as many as 40 people a lot of the time. That when they would go to do this, it's easy to say because he was the leader, we kind of pin all the, it's easy to kind of pin it on him like he's the one who did it all. But I think Paul would readily say he's got a team of people that he worked with, traveled with, brought him what he needed, supported him. He could send them out to other towns while he worked in this town. Definitely a group effort, a team effort, as it continues to be. But you're right. What a resume. And from what we've seen in his letters, Paul is not the kind of guy to lean on his resume at this point. He would just lean on Christ and him crucified, right? Something that stands out to me is that any of Paul's letters that you look at, the question is, Paul's got all these letters that he writes to specific circumstances. In my opinion, I don't think there are any New Testament letters that aren't somewhat trying to answer and speak to a certain context. I think people make a mistake, for example, with the book of Romans. I've known many people who try to treat Romans like Paul has written out this big systematic theology just so we have it. And if you look at the end of Romans, it's absolutely written for the context that he's writing to. This tension between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians trying to be together. That's the situation that he's writing to. But all of his letters have particular things. But what stands out to me is that there is no situation that Paul ever writes to where he doesn't wish grace and peace. I wonder if you could express what you think the significance is of those two terms, grace and peace. What is it about grace and peace that is so universally needed? It was the thing that Paul felt, whether he was writing to an individual or writing to a congregation that he was close to or a group of people in a city he'd never met before. Grace and peace were the one thing that was really consistent from letter to letter that Paul would wish on you grace, and he would wish for you peace. I've thought about that a lot. It seems to me like regardless of what situation we're up against, churches, you face all kinds of unexpected problems. You never know exactly where a source of tension is going to come from because we're like this big interwoven family. And sometimes the issue isn't even really the issue. It's these two people mad about this thing between these two people that happened years ago. And now it's manifesting in this whole unrelated thing just because they already had this thing over here. But how many times what we need is an extra measure of grace, that I will show you mercy and kindness even beyond what you deserve or what I would deserve, that we would choose to give each other more grace. God is always increasing his grace for us, and that we would wish and work for peace. That I would, as far as it depends on me, do everything within my power to maintain peace with people, not to stir up conflict needlessly, not to make everything about me, but to practice grace and peace. Those, if you were to look through Paul's letters, I would argue, even if it's not the big theme he's writing on, it's always in there. It's never far from Paul's scope that, what does this church need? Well, we can talk about the specifics, but somehow these specifics are a working out of how they need more grace and more peace in their life. And I think that's a useful thing to consider. I'm also curious, we're talking about passing the torch. It's been a tough summer for me. I had one of my grandmothers pass away. My other grandmother is now in assisted living as of this week. And so, one I've lost, the other is now taking a step that, probably not going back from this step. So it's definitely weighed on me the last few months, seeing people that I'm close to in poor health. And I've thought a lot about so many who have already gone on. A blessing of having a large family is that you have tons and tons of people to enjoy in your life as you're growing up. But that blessing far outweighs the detrimental side, but it does have a detrimental side, which is if you grew up with all these people you care about, eventually you have to watch them all pass. And I'm in kind of that second phase now, and it has been a painful few years. We've had a lot of people pass away in my family. Got a really large family. But I've been thinking some about the cloud of witnesses, to borrow language from Hebrews. I'm curious, when you think about the cloud of witnesses, I bet there are some people that if you wanted to imagine who it is that would be cheering you on, wishing you success, offering you a word of encouragement, who would be someone in your personal cloud of witnesses? Who would be some people that you think of? Because I think that gives us a good key to, if there's anyone we ought to emulate, if we're going to take on the torch from anyone, surely we ought to try and pick up the torch from someone that really made an impact on your life. I'm just curious if you have any people or any stories you would share of someone that you like to think of in your personal cloud of witnesses. I do think it should be the case, if possible, that everyone's got someone in your life who is just almost irrationally, eternally on your side and in your corner. That was always my granny for me. She was always my loudest cheerleader, so that's been a tough loss for me. But I think that's really important. Let's see. Yes, had several battles regarding the concept of grace over law. He had to constantly remind his readers that grace is the ruling factor. And, Sandy, sometimes when we get into these disputes, because we still have disputes about, being too rule-oriented or too, I don't want to say grace-oriented, because it isn't always grace that people are pushing as the opposite of rule-keeping. Sometimes it's kind of like a law obsession versus lawlessness. And we have to understand that each of those is not the antidote for the other. If the problem is you're just living too wild and you're not taking anything serious enough, we really got to ratchet down on the rules. It isn't the rules in and of themselves that are there to save you. They could be a tutor or something to help you along, but it isn't just about rule keeping. And likewise, if you've grown up where everything was too rigid and you were too rule obsessed and trying to kind of achieve your own righteousness by how well you obeyed every little thing you could figure out, the solution is not to just throw them all to the wind and act as if God doesn't have any principles and it's all just love each other and be happy, right? So those two are not solutions for each other. It's actually grace, isn't it? It's grace that we need over either of those. And so we don't need law obsession. We don't need lawlessness. What we need is grace, that we take God's love seriously, that we take his will for us seriously, and that we're also, even as we want to challenge each other to live better, like iron sharpening iron, we don't lose sight of the fact that even as I might offer a corrective to you, I myself am also a sinner in need of a Savior and in need of help and guidance. And so grace helps us to keep kind of a sense of, sorry, I got a notification there, kind of a sense of humility as we work with each other. And that's good, Sandy. Yeah, grace brings peace with it. Peace becomes possible because I don't insist that each person is only treated exactly how they deserve. That sure wouldn't work out well for me. But yeah, that's very good. Thank you for those comments. So again, just curious if you have anyone you would mention as like someone in your personal cloud of witnesses that you have looked up to, that you were thankful for their influence in your life. Something else that I don't want to harp on this too hard, but I've got to say that at the point that I entered ministry, I'm in this for now about 17 years, and I will say it is a true statement. In 17 years, I genuinely don't remember what it feels like to be bored. There are just way too many things to be done. You know, like every church I've been part of, it's like no matter how many things we do or accomplish, I can see 15 others that I haven't had a chance to get to yet that we've still got to work on, right? Like it's a constant thing that we're always striving to adapt and to grow. It is a real thing I struggle with if any Christian would just tell me that they are bored. I think there are just too many good things needing to be done. And if I'm feeling bored with the contents, if I'm feeling bored with church in general, I would ask, how much skin do you have in the game? How much are you really jumping in and striving to make a difference somewhere? Where are you raising your hands? I've been thinking about some ideas on this. There are definitely some people groups that I'm sure we could do a better job of engaging and including who might not be physically capable to do things in the traditional sense that we've kind of think of the work of the church. But man, there's just room for everyone to do more. This is good. Yeah, so my mom would be one. Another one of my witnesses was the wife of one of the elders at my home congregation. The preacher's wife that I work with at camp. Yeah, it makes a difference to have someone that you look up to who is kind and encouraging toward you, doesn't it, Cheryl? So that's just a question for you to ponder. But if a person ever tells me they're bored, my immediate, whether or not I say it out loud or say something else, my first thought in my head is, how much skin do you have in the game if you're bored? Because boy, I don't have enough of me to go around. There's so many things that need to get done. What does good delegation look like? If we're going to make sure that the next generation, and it doesn't even have to just be like the younger people, it's just none of us can do any job forever. So to make sure the next person can step in, whether it's a peer or a younger person or even an older person, here are some things we ought to always strive to make available. First would be to make it really clear what the desired results are. Hey, here's this thing I need your help with. If you were to do a good job, here's what it would end up looking like. It's important as part of that we don't insist on only our own methodology, right? If we're going to let another person own an area, own a project, own a program, they need the chance to also work out what they want some of their own methods to be. Maybe we show them ours, but we've got to pull back and say, hey, it's kind of up to you how you want to go about getting this done. Here's the desired outcome that I have. You got to tell people what the banks of the river are. Here is how much is too much. Here is how little is too little. Staying within these parameters, you got all the freedom in here to, again, do whatever you want method-wise, but, make sure not to cross this point or cross this point. What are the guidelines? Here's what you've got to work with. Most often that needs to look like a budget, right? I need to know what I can spend, what I can do, what are my resources, who are the people that I get to pull from. There has to be accountability. It's not sufficient just to say, hey, I told someone to take this over and run with it and empowered them, but you never follow up with them. Not only should you follow up with them, but what is the plan for how often you will. Hey, let's get this started and let's go ahead and put it on the calendar that in 3 months we're going to grab lunch and talk about how it's going. What's the accountability and what are the consequences of a job done really, really well? What's at stake? What are some of the great things that could happen if they owned this and made it a wonderful thing? What would be the detriment if they chose not to follow through and they let this thing fall? What would be the consequences of that? Good to have all of that information, all of that included in how it is we try to pass things on. So passing the torch, as far as nuts and bolts of what that ought to look like, I would argue that's a pretty good example for what you could look for. Someone needs to know the desired results, the guidelines, resources, accountability, and the ultimate consequences of what it is they're trying to do. I'm going to conclude with this and say, just don't ever underestimate the formative power of an encouraging word. I have seen this take place in a variety of ways. A couple of years ago, I have a podcast. I don't have a lot of time to do podcasting. Every once in a while, I manage to squeeze out one or two. But I did an interview with a Harding professor named Anessa Westbrook, who has especially studied what helps women to grow spiritually, and she was looking especially at women in churches of Christ. Something that seems to be the case for women that is a bit different than men that she pointed out. With young men, they do really well if they put themselves out there and then get lots of pats on the back. So if you want to encourage a guy along, let him give it a shot and then give him a lot of attaboys, good job, go get him, keep doing it, you're going to get better every time. But she found that for young women, it was often the case, they really needed their encouragement more on the front end. And so rather than just throwing them out there, they needed lots of affirmation that I believe you can do this and you're going to do great and you're going to make it and I'm going to walk with you and we're going to get there and you're going to be so proud of yourself on the other side. But that was an interesting gender difference that she came across, was that men, especially young men, tended to respond better to congratulations and affirmation after the fact, but women tended to need it a little earlier, on the front end was kind of the important side for them. So I thought that was interesting. I've mentioned this before, I believe, but the congregation that I was at before I came to King's Crossing was the Old Hickory Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. Something that I will always remember about Old Hickory was that I spent a lot of time, like Old Hickory is definitely a church who has like the former glory days, like back before churches got very big in the 1950s and 60s, they were a 900 member church, which was pretty much unheard of at the time. And I started asking the old members who remembered and were part of the glory days what it was that had made it so good. In fact, there's an article on Old Hickory that got published in Restoration Quarterly, which is a good scholarly journal. And Phil Slate studied them and noticed the way that they had produced this vast number of preachers. There were so many people who went on to become ministers, elders, church planters. And he said, unfortunately, in the research, it's even hard to account for the number of young women who grew up to be married to ministers and missionaries or to do a lot of work themselves. It's harder in the culture to account for that. But when we started asking the questions of what made people be the way they were, the thing that I kept getting was the way that the elders especially were so good about always dropping by kids' Sunday school classes where they would just go around the room and they knew the kids by name and they would just say, Susie, I bet one day you're going to grow up and be a missionary. And Billy, I bet you're going to grow up to be a preacher. And Jenny, I bet you're going to be a phenomenal Sunday school teacher. And they would just walk around and affirm all the kids. And they kept planting these ideas in their head that I bet you're going to grow up to do this. And lo and behold, they all did. It absolutely worked. So I would say as a means of encouragement, just don't ever underestimate that formative power of a word of encouragement. So if there's someone you were thinking of encouraging, please don't let that idea pass you by and not act on it. And if it means just a quick card or a text or a phone call, if there's someone you see potential in, or maybe someone you don't even quite see it yet, but you'd like to believe it could be in there somewhere, I encourage you to be very proactive in helping to put ideas in the minds of people and help them to envision themselves taking a bigger role in things. Because if you don't put those ideas in their head, where else are they going to come from? If the church family, if we don't affirm each other and push each other toward leadership, it's not going to come from anywhere else, right? So that's just something I would encourage you to think about. Don't ever underestimate the formative power of an encouraging word. I've believed for a long time how much of leadership hinges around, people want to say that talk is cheap, but it really isn't. I mean, some people use talk cheaply, but God creates the world initially by speaking it into existence. And I can't do it anywhere near that degree, but when you speak into a person what you wish for them, what you desire for them, what you hope for them, a lot of times that word produces a good fruit, and way more than we might anticipate. So your words matter, your presence matters, and you don't have to be the head of an organization to be thinking about passing on what role you've played and helping someone else find their place to serve and to belong. Because again, all of us reach that point where I cannot now do all the things that I once did, and someone else is going to have to. And it's kind of on me if I don't ever give anyone else space to learn or space to grow. That should be an important part of everything that we do. So thank you all for your thoughts and comments tonight. As always, you can download that Church Center app, and we use that for several different purposes. Yeah, and it's hard to know exactly the number, right, Cheryl-Lynn? It takes 10 affirmations to fix one negative. But isn't that the case? That I could have, we could have like a fantastic day, and, you could have 25 people say really nice things to you, but the one you would think the most about is the one person who offered you a critique instead, or said something really negative or unkind. It could just be someone who honked at me in traffic that I'll think about for way longer than that person deserves, right? So yeah, we've got to be really careful what we do with our presence. Do you speak positively to people and about people, or are you giving them life, or are you sucking the life out of them? Because you're going to be doing one or the other, and important to do that well. All right. I appreciate everybody's thoughts and comments tonight. I think that gets me to the end of my comments. We are here every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Got one more lesson in the book, and we're going to jump topics. Y'all tell me what you think about this. I'm thinking it might be fun to do, before I jump into the next one, it might be fun to do a week or two of maybe just some general question answer stuff. I haven't done an Ask Mark Anything session in a while. So if there's anything you're just kind of curious about and you'd like me to, kind of go off the cuff and just see what happens, I'm open to that. It might be fun to kind of do something spontaneous here for a week or two. So yeah, y'all tell me what you're interested in talking about, and we'll be transitioning into a new topic here very soon. And thank you, Cheryl, for your words of affirmation. I need those as well. You guys have a great rest of your week. Lord willing, we will see all of you Sunday, if not sooner. And we will let you go. Okay. Sandy already has a question. Sandy, you can post it here, or you can email me. I'll be looking for it. Y'all have a great rest of your night.